Harry Hopkins was an Iowa social worker who became one of the most powerful unelected officials in American history. Harry Lloyd Hopkins, New Deal administrator, presidential advisor, and wartime diplomat, was born in Sioux City, Iowa on August 17, 1890. He came from a modest middle-class family. He had a lean frame with his sharp features and restless energy. Hopkins' early years were marked by social conscience and practical idealism. He attended Grinnell College in Iowa, graduating in 1912. His education there shaped his understanding of social problems and government responsibility, though his later career would test those principles in ways he could never have imagined. After graduating from college, Hopkins moved to New York City to work in settlement houses, institutions that provided services to the urban poor. He began his career at Christodor House on the Lower East Side, working with immigrants and impoverished families. He quickly demonstrated a talent for organization and a genuine commitment to helping the disadvantaged. During this time, Hopkins was already developing his understanding of poverty and social welfare. He joined the progressive movement that was transforming American attitudes toward government responsibility for social problems. His practical experience with poverty set him apart from theoretical reformers and academic sociologists. In 1913, Hopkins joined the Association for Improving the Condition of the Poor, one of New York's leading charitable organizations. He worked his way up through the organization, learning the mechanics of relief administration and developing his philosophy that the poor deserved assistance as a right, not as charity. His work brought him into contact with other social workers and reformers who would shape the emerging field of social welfare. In 1913, Hopkins married Ethel Gross, a fellow social worker he had met in New York. Ethel shared his commitment to social reform and supported his career, though the demands of his work would strain their marriage. They would have 3 sons together, but Hopkins' intense devotion to his work left little time for family life. The marriage would eventually end in divorce in 1931, a casualty of Hopkins' single-minded focus on his career and causes. During World War I, Hopkins worked for the Red Cross, managing civilian relief programs in the South. The experience taught him how to administer large-scale relief operations and work with government agencies. After the war, he returned to New York and became director of the New York Tuberculosis Association. In 1924, he became executive director of the New York Tuberculosis and Health Association, a position that gave him prominence in the social welfare field. He was becoming known as an efficient administrator who could manage complex organizations and deliver results. His reputation was built on practical achievement rather than theoretical innovation. The stock market crash of 1929 and the ensuing Great Depression transformed Hopkins' career and gave him the opportunity to implement his ideas on a massive scale. As unemployment soared and private charities were overwhelmed, Hopkins was appointed to lead New York State's Temporary Emergency Relief Administration in 1931. The position was created by Governor Franklin Roosevelt, who was responding to the unprecedented crisis with unprecedented government act. Hopkins threw himself into the work with characteristic energy. He believed that the unemployed needed jobs, not handouts, and that government had a responsibility to provide work relief. He administered relief funds efficiently and fought against the stigma that treated unemployment as a personal failing rather than an economic catastrophe. Hopkins' work in New York brought him to Roosevelt's attention as a capable administrator who shared the governor's belief in active government. When Roosevelt was elected president in 1932, he brought Hopkins to Washington to help address the national emergency. In May 1933, Roosevelt appointed Hopkins to head the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, which distributed federal funds to state relief agencies. Hopkins attacked the job with furious energy, spending over $5 million in his first 2 hours on the job. He believed that speed was essential, that people were starving and needed help immediately. He had no patience for bureaucratic delay or administrative caution. Hopkins' approach to relief administration was controversial. He insisted on work relief rather than direct handouts whenever possible, believing that work preserved dignity and skills. He fought against means tests and investigations that humiliated relief recipients. He battled with state officials who were slow to distribute funds or who discriminated against certain groups. He made enemies among conservatives who saw him as a dangerous radical spending taxpayer money recklessly. But he also made the federal relief system work, getting help to millions of Americans who had nowhere else to turn. In 1935, Roosevelt created the Works Progress Administration, the largest and most ambitious work relief program in American history. Hopkins was the natural choice to lead it. The WPA would employ millions of Americans building roads, schools, parks, and public buildings. It would also employ artists, writers, musicians, and actors in cultural projects that brought art to communities across the country. Hopkins administered the WPA with the same energy and impatience he had shown at FVRA. He believed that the unemployed were victims of economic forces beyond their control and deserved government help. He fought constantly for larger appropriations and defended the WPA against critics who called it wasteful or socialist. The WPA made Hopkins one of the most powerful and controversial figures in Washington. He controlled billions of dollars and millions of jobs. His critics accused him of using WPA jobs for political patronage, rewarding Democratic supporters and punishing Republican opponents. There was some truth to these charges, though Hopkins always insisted that need, not politics, determined who received help. His defenders pointed to the WPA's achievements: the infrastructure built, the people employed, the dignity preserved. Hopkins himself was unapologetic. He believed the WPA was saving American democracy by preventing the desperation that could lead to revolution or dictatorship. Hopkins' personal life during these years was marked by tragedy and change. His first marriage had ended in divorce in 1931. In 1931, he married Barbara Duncan, a young woman from a wealthy family. They had one daughter together, but Barbara died of cancer in 1937, leaving Hopkins devastated. He threw himself even more intensely into his work, using it to escape his grief. In 1942, Hopkins would marry for a third time to Louise Macy, a fashion editor who brought some stability to his chaotic personal life. But throughout his career, work always came first, relationships second. By the late 1930s, Hopkins had become more than an administrator. He had become one of Roosevelt's closest advisors, part of the inner circle that shaped New Deal policy. Roosevelt valued Hopkins' political instincts, his administrative ability, and his absolute loyalty. Hopkins moved into the White House in 1940, living in the Lincoln bedroom and becoming Roosevelt's constant companion. Their relationship was unique in American politics, a partnership between president and advisor based on complete trust and shared vision. Hopkins had no formal position that justified his influence, but everyone in Washington knew that he spoke for the president. In 1940, Hopkins briefly pursued the Democratic presidential nomination, hoping to succeed Roosevelt if the president chose not to run for a third term. Hopkins had no political base and little popular support, but he believed his closeness to Roosevelt might carry him to the nomination. When Roosevelt decided to run again, Hopkins' presidential ambitions evaporated. He accepted his role as advisor rather than principal, though some observers believed he never entirely abandoned his presidential dreams. The episode revealed Hopkins' ambition, his willingness to use his position for personal advancement, though he would spend the rest of his life serving Roosevelt rather than pursuing his own political career. When World War II began in Europe in 1939, Hopkins became increasingly involved in foreign policy and defense matters. He had no background in diplomacy or military affairs, but Roosevelt trusted his judgment and used him as a personal representative in dealing with foreign leaders. In January 1941, Roosevelt sent Hopkins to London to assess British needs and meet with Winston Churchill. Hopkins arrived in a Britain under siege, bombed nightly by German aircraft, fighting alone against Nazi Germany. He met with Churchill and was deeply moved by British determination. He reported back to Roosevelt that Britain would fight on and deserved American support. Hopkins' mission to London marked the beginning of his role as Roosevelt's personal diplomat. He became the primary channel of communication between Roosevelt and Churchill, traveling repeatedly between Washington and London. Churchill came to trust Hopkins completely, recognizing that he spoke with Roosevelt's authority. Hopkins attended all the major wartime conferences, sitting beside Roosevelt at meetings with Churchill and Stalin. He had no official diplomatic position, but he wielded more influence than the Secretary of State. His power came entirely from his relationship with Roosevelt, from the president's trust and confidence. Hopkins' role in World War II was primarily as facilitator and fixer. He administered the Lend-Lease program, which provided American military aid to Britain and later the Soviet Union. He coordinated war production, pushing agencies and departments to work together and overcome bureaucratic obstacles. He smoothed over conflicts between military leaders and civilian officials. He prepared Roosevelt for conferences and meetings, briefing him on issues and personalities. He carried messages to Churchill and Stalin, negotiating details that couldn't be handled through normal diplomatic channels. He was everywhere, involved in everything, operating on nervous energy and cigarettes. Hopkins' health had never been good, and the strain of wartime service destroyed what remained of it. He suffered from a chronic digestive disorder that left him gaunt and weak. He underwent multiple surgeries and spent months in hospitals. Doctors warned him that he was killing himself with overwork, but Hopkins refused to slow down. He believed the war was the defining struggle of his generation and that he had to contribute everything he had. Roosevelt needed him, and Hopkins would not let the president down even if it cost him his life. In July 1945, Hopkins undertook one final mission for the United States, though Roosevelt had died in April. President Harry Truman sent Hopkins to Moscow to meet with Stalin and resolve disputes that threatened the alliance. Hopkins was so ill that he could barely walk, but he went anyway. He He met with Stalin and negotiated agreements on Poland and other issues. It was Hopkins' last significant public service. He returned to Washington exhausted and resigned from government service. He had given everything to the war effort and had nothing left. After leaving government, Hopkins tried to resume a normal life. He took a position in the private sector and hoped to recover his health. But the damage was too extensive. His digestive problems worsened and he underwent more surgeries. He tried to write his memoirs but lacked the energy to complete them. He had spent himself completely in government service and had no reserves left. On January 29, 1946, less than a year after Roosevelt's death, Harry Hopkins died in New York City. He was only 55 years old. The cause of death was complications from his chronic illnesses, though in truth he had worked himself to death in service to Roosevelt and the nation. Hopkins' funeral was attended by dignitaries from around the world. Tributes praised his service during the Depression and the war. Churchill sent a message calling Hopkins one of the architects of victory. Truman praised his selfless dedication. Hopkins was buried in his hometown in Iowa, far from the centers of power where he had wielded such influence. His death marked the end of an era, the passing of the New Deal generation that had transformed American government and led the nation through depression and war. Hopkins' legacy is complex and contested. He was an unelected official who wielded enormous power, accountable only to Roosevelt. He spent billions of dollars with little oversight and used government programs for political purposes. He made decisions that affected millions of lives based on his own judgment of what was necessary. Critics saw him as a dangerous example of unchecked bureaucratic power, a symbol of big government run amok. They pointed to WPA waste and inefficiency, to Hopkins' political manipulation of relief programs, to his arrogance and impatience with democratic processes. Yet Hopkins' defenders argued that he got things done when action was desperately needed. He fed the hungry and employed the jobless during the Depression. He helped arm Britain and the Soviet Union during the war. He facilitated cooperation between Allied leaders and helped win the war. He was loyal, effective, and incorruptible in his personal dealings, never using his position for financial gain. He believed in government as a force for good and dedicated his life to public service. His methods were sometimes questionable, but his motives were pure and his achievements substantial. Modern historians have generally been sympathetic to Hopkins, recognizing that the crises he faced required extraordinary measures. They acknowledge that the Depression and World War II were emergencies that justified concentrated power and rapid action. They note that Hopkins' work relief programs, whatever their flaws, were more humane and effective than the alternatives of direct relief or no relief at all. They credit him with helping to save American democracy during the Depression and helping to win World War II. They recognize that his closeness to Roosevelt, while constitutionally questionable, made him effective in ways that formal officials could never have been. Yet even sympathetic historians acknowledge the problems with Hopkins' role. He represented a type of government power that sits uneasily with democratic principles. He was never elected to anything, never confirmed by the Senate, never formally accountable to anyone except Roosevelt. His power came from personal relationships rather than constitutional authority. He made policy in areas where he had no expertise and no formal responsibility. He bypassed normal channels and ignored established procedures. He represented the dangers of personal government, where influence depends on proximity to the leader rather than institutional position. Hopkins also represented the New Deal approach to government, the belief that expert administrators could solve social problems through government programs. He had faith in government planning and centralized control. He believed that trained professionals like himself knew better than ordinary people what was needed. He had little patience for local control, states' rights, or limited government. His approach worked during emergencies when decisive action was essential, but it created a model of government that would become increasingly controversial as the emergencies passed. Perhaps the most striking thing about Hopkins was his absolute dedication to public service. He sacrificed his health, his family life, and ultimately his life for his work. He could have made far more money in the private sector, could have preserved his health by working less, could have enjoyed the fruits of his success. Instead, he worked himself to death for causes he believed in and a president he served. This kind of selfless dedication is rare in any era and commands respect even from those who disagreed with his policies. Hopkins' relationship with Roosevelt was the defining feature of his career. He had no independent political base, no constituency of his own, no achievements that were his alone rather than Roosevelt's. He was always the assistant, the facilitator, the man behind the throne. Some saw this as a weakness, a lack of independence and vision. Others saw it as a strength, a willingness to subordinate ego to effectiveness. Hopkins understood that his power came from Roosevelt and never tried to build an independent empire. When Roosevelt died, Hopkins' career effectively ended. He had no role to play without Roosevelt, no position that justified his influence. In the end, Harry Hopkins was neither a visionary leader nor a mere bureaucrat, but rather an extraordinarily capable administrator and loyal advisor who served during times of crisis. His legacy includes both the relief programs that helped millions during the Depression and the questions about concentrated power that his career raises. He is remembered today for his role in the New Deal and World War II, for his relationship with Roosevelt, and for his self-sacrificing dedication to public service. This is perhaps incomplete for a man who wielded such power and influenced such momentous events, but history often focuses on presidents rather than their advisors. Hopkins represents a particular type of American public servant, the dedicated administrator who serves a cause and a leader with complete loyalty, but whose own vision and independence are subordinated to that service. History is full of such figures, men who enable great leaders to achieve great things but who never step into the spotlight themselves. Hopkins' tragedy was not that he lacked ability or vision, but that his abilities were always in service to someone else's vision. He was always Roosevelt's man, never his own, yet perhaps this is unfair to Hopkins. He chose his role deliberately, understanding that he could accomplish more as Roosevelt's trusted advisor than he ever could as an independent politician. He had no illusions about his own political appeal or leadership qualities. He knew his strengths were administrative and tactical rather than visionary or charismatic. He found the role that suited his talents and played it brilliantly. If he never achieved independent greatness, he contributed to achievements greater than most independent leaders ever accomplish. William Jennings Bryan and Harry Hopkins represent opposite types of American political figures. Bryan was the charismatic orator who led movements and inspired millions but never achieved power. Hopkins was the behind-the-scenes operator who wielded enormous power but never led anything independently. Bryan is remembered for speeches and campaigns, Hopkins for programs and missions. Bryan fought against the future, Hopkins helped build it. Yet both were dedicated public servants who gave their lives to causes they believed in, and both left legacies that continue to shape American politics and government.